Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 2nd of June of 2024. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's talk about Kharkiv direction. Where the Russians continue their offensive operation, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received lots of updates, just few geolocations of artillery strikes, how the Russians were, let's say, hunting and destroying the Ukrainian positions in the vicinity of Kazachia Lopen, so more precisely on Zolochiv direction, and few armored vehicles, few tanks were destroyed, let's say on Liptsy area. For example, on this video we can see the movement of Ukrainian tank who was moving toward the hidden position, but the Russians discovered that T-72, and as a result of counter-artillery strike or Lancet strike, that system, that tank was destroyed. So nothing more from this direction, just regular updates. Yet we haven't received any confirmation whether the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions as a result of possible counterattacks, or the Russians managed to answer Liptsy and to dig in deeper inside the, let's say, of the border of the, let's say, town by the name of Liptsy. Now let's move to Vovchansk direction. We have additional updates from Starita. A very interesting video was published today by the Ukrainian sources. For example, on this video we can see the FPV drone strikes of 42nd Mechanized Brigade on Russian armored vehicles that were heading from the town by the name of village by the name of Liptsy towards the border of Russian Federation. Very interesting video from this point of view. Once again, the Russian tanks, according to that video, was moving from Starita through the fields towards the forest and further probably to the border, but the Ukrainian FPV drones of 42nd Brigade attacked the Russian tanks and some of them were destroyed. So I have a question: why the Russians were moving their tanks from Starita to the borderlands? Maybe to service the tanks, maybe to repair the tanks, or maybe the Russians are, let's say, abandoning their positions from the line of combat contact for some reason. Currently we don't have the answer to this question. Now let's move to Vovchansk itself. We have a few geolocations, few important updates. For example, when talking just about updates, we have the photo of destroyed striker along Vovcha River, somewhere in the eastern part of the northern Vovchansk. We have another Lancet strike on Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian engineering machine in the southern part. The Russians managed to discover, and as a result of Lancet strike, they managed to set this vehicle on fire, and the vehicle was destroyed later. When talking about the northern part of Vovchansk, as you can see, we don't have any updates, we don't have any videos of how the Russians were bombing the citadel, we don't have updates about further Russian progress in the southern part. The only thing we have is report from the Western Analytics, more precisely Bild, reported that the armored forces of Ukraine counter-attacked in Vovchansk, Kharkiv Oblast, and retook several blocks. So according to Bild, the Ukrainians counter-attacked in direction, let's say, from, let's say, the citadel, from the citadel a little bit to the northwest, and as a result of clashes, the positions in the vicinity of the Vovchansk college and let's say kindergarten was retaken under the Ukrainians. Also, as a result of counterattack from the industrial zone, the Ukrainians restored control over the court building, and according to the Bild, the Ukrainians conducted few counterattacks in the eastern direction. Currently we can't tell for sure whether it's true or not, whether it's speculation, wishful thinking, or the reality, but for example, today this post was published by Bild, and today Bild also published the post about additional Russian progress in the northern part of Chasiv Yar. We have discussed this video already. According to Bild, they confirmed the information that the Russians established complete control over the northern part. So that's why maybe the situation of Vovchansk is correct, this post that was published by Bild. So for now we haven't received any geolocations confirming this, but it is very interesting piece of information, and we need more details to understand whether the Ukrainians began counterattacks or it was just a fake update or official thinking. Now let's move further to the line of combat contact. We have some geolocations confirming the Russian, let's say, counter-artillery duels. For example, in this video we can see very far from the line of combat contact to the south east of Kharkiv, the Ukrainians brought additional artillery system. They were trying to, let's say, bring also some artillery rounds for artillery system, but the Russians discovered, attack, and then there was a secondary detonation, and the entire artillery system with the crew was destroyed. So very important and very very interesting update telling us and confirming that the Russians still have complete superiority on this direction, still have, let's say, possibility to destroy significant number of Ukrainian artillery systems without any counter-artillery duels. Now let's move to the line of combat contact, and first let's talk about Kislovka-Kotlarovka direction. Currently this area is very active. If we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of May, we're gonna see the complete superiority of the Russian forces, also artillery strikes, a significant number of Lancet strikes, FPV drone strikes, a lot of destroyed pontoon bridges, a lot of destroyed, let's say, safe roads from one bank of Oskol river to another, complete superiority in the vicinity of Stepovo Novoselka, but without any attempts to attack the territory on the ground. So we can make a conclusion that the Russians are still in the clearing process, but as soon as they finish the process, they will start the operation on the ground. When talking about Stelmahovka, Mesazharevka, we continue receiving just the posts, just the telegram posts without any, let's say, video confirmations of additional Russian progress. Today we got additional update that the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of Mesazharevka. So to summarize everything, the battle for Stelmahovka is already about to start, but yet for some reason the Russians still haven't started this. Now let's move to Siversk direction. We have additional updates, very important updates, and according to different mappers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to improve their positions along the railways. If summarize everything, every single post we received today from this direction, the Russians managed to establish control or to improve their positions along the railways of something like this, and that means that the Russians captured the rich network of the fortifications between Vyimka, Berestova and Spornaya, and the Russians, the most important, managed to answer the hill, because all these fortifications are located on the hill, and the Russians currently on the same level as the Ukrainians that located further to the west, to the northwest and to the north in direction of Vyimka, Ivano-Darivka and Siversk itself. So the Russians continue offensive, the Russians continue semi-encirclement of Spornaya. When talking about Spornaya itself, we got significant number of geolocations of FPV drone strikes of how the Russians continue bombing and clearing the territory. But once again, another day without any attempts to attack the village on the ground. Furthermore, we got significant number of videos of successful counter-artillery duels. For example, on this video, we can see how the Russians were hunting the Ukrainian positions, artillery positions, tank positions, and as a result of counter-artillery duels, the Russians managed to destroy up to 2 or 3 vehicles on this direction. So the Russians preparing the foothold before further offensive. And if we summarize everything, and if we calculate the distance between the edge Russian positions along Vyimka, because Vyimka is the closest Russian positions to Siversk, and Siversk itself, we're gonna see that the distance between Russian forces and the first buildings of Siversk is less than 8 kilometers. So 8 kilometers and Russia will start assault on Siversk. So very short distance. Every single kilometer will increase and intensify the clashes in direction, and most likely will increase the Ukrainian losses. We understand that as soon as the Russians reach Vyimka, they're going to be completely different story in the battle for Siversk. Now let's move further to Chasiv Yar direction. During the previous day, we haven't received any additional updates about further Russian progress in the northern part of Chasiv Yar. Just Build confirmed this update. Just Build confirmed that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt in Kalinovka, that the Russians captured Kalinovka for around 50, 60, 70%. The Russians established complete control over Lisovo Street, at least in the eastern part of Kalinovka and in the central part. On this video, let's take a look at this video once again. The Russians safely, without any resistance from the Ukrainian side, crossed Seversk Donetsk canal. The Russians landed their infantry, and after that the Russians continue moving further to the north, in the northwestern direction. And this is the most important part, that for some reason the Russians continue moving further. If we summarize everything, the Russians currently control not just positions and the trenches along Seversk Donetsk canal, but due to the direction of Russian vehicle further to the northwest, we can make a conclusion that most likely the Russians also establish complete control over the farms that located in this area. For now, of course, we're not going to adjust the map, we're not going to change anything, but most likely this is exactly what we have on this direction. Of course, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians conducted several counterattacks, but so for now, once again, by let's say 8 p.m. of the local time on the 2nd of June, we don't have any updates whether the Russians managed to improve their positions or whether the Ukrainians managed to counterattack and to regain control over the lost positions. When talking about eastern Chasiv Chasiv Yar itself, nothing special, just regular artillery strikes, regular artillery bombings, FPV drone strikes without any changes on the ground. Anyway, the most important thing is that the Russians crossed Siversk Donetsk-Donbass canal in the vicinity of Kalinovka, and most likely the Russians crossed the same canal to the south of Chasiv Yar in the area of Stupki-Golubkovsky forest in German forest. And if these two updates are confirmed, then the Ukrainians have a critical situation, and most likely we can start counting days when the entire Chasiv Yar is going to fall. Now let's talk about Klishchiivka area. We got significant number of geolocations of FPV drone strikes, of artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions. The Russians, after they capture Klishchiivka, Avdiivka, after they managed to establish complete control over Ivanovske, moved their focus further to the fields between these settlements and start bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces in Ukrainian positions, trying to force the Ukrainians to completely abandon their positions and to move to the Ukrainian side of Siversk Donetsk-Donbass canal. This is very important, let's say, points in Russian strategy, in Russian, let's say, plan to capture Chasiv Yar, because currently a significant number of forces are concentrated along the line of combat contact, starting from, let's say, Stupki-Golubkovsky, Ivanovska, Klishchiivka, then further to the south to Avdiivka, and further to the south to Zelenopolye-Kurdyumovka. Probably one or maybe one brigade is responsible for this entire direction. So to reduce the number of forces involved in this area, they need to force the Ukrainians to fall back. After that, the Russians would be able to release and extra forces to Chasiv Yar itself. Now let's move further to Avdiivka direction. We have lots of, as you can see, significant number of updates. The Russians continue offensive operation. The Russians managed to enter Novoalexandrovka. We have additional geolocations and videos confirming this. For example, on this video we can see a series of attacks of 110th Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine with FPV drone strikes or FPV drones on Russian armored vehicles. And for example, on this episode we can see how the Ukrainian FPV drone attacked the Russian personnel carrier, who was moving from Novoalexandrovka to, let's say, Ocheretyne. This is a very important video because the Ukrainians attacked the Russians right exactly in this area. So most likely we can make a conclusion that the Russian personnel carrier first arrived somewhere here, somewhere in the, let's say, closer to central part of Novoalexandrovka. The Russians landed infantry, and then the personnel carrier was moving back in direction of Ocheretyne. And during the, let's say, movements during this way to Ocheretyne, the Ukrainians conducted few FPV drone strikes on that carrier, but they haven't managed to destroy it. Anyway, this video first of all confirms that most likely the Russians managed to establish complete control over already this part of Novoalexandrovka. Furthermore, the Russians managed to dig in deeper, and that the Russians are moving further to the central and the western part of the same village. So significant progress. Of course, if the Russians are able to capture Novoalexandrovka, this is going to be a disaster for the Ukrainians. The Russians would be able to shorten the distance between their positions and the first, let's say, towns in Pokrovsk agglomeration for minimal value. Now let's move further to the south in direction of Karlovka Water Reserve, where we also have significant clashes between Ukrainian and Russian forces. We have updates. Just yesterday we were talking that as a result of offensive operation, according to different mappers, the Russians captured this tree line and, let's say, established their positions as close as possible to Sokol itself. And starting of today, the Russians made few attempts to attack Sokol itself with significant number of armored vehicles. The video was published by the 47th Mechanized Brigade. On that video we could see how the Russians were moving along this road, trying to get as close as possible to Sokol, but most of those armored vehicles were stopped by Ukraine FPV drone strikes, and the Russians, at least that attack failed, but that was the first attack with the purpose to discover the Ukrainian FPV and artillery positions and then to destroy them. When talking about the western part, we have a lot of videos of how the Russians also conducted complete successful counter-artillery duels. Few more artillery systems, few more howitzers were destroyed on the line of Vovcha, Karlovka Water Reserve and in the vicinity of Zhelanne. So now let's move further to the south in direction of the artillery pocket between Novosilovka Persha and Umanske. Today the Russians, more precisely the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians, as a result of a very heavy and bloody offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Umanske. According to different mappers, according to geolocations, the Russians captured Umanske probably a week ago. We have the geolocations from the most southwestern part of the village of Russian flags and many other things, but most likely during the previous 5 days the Russians were clearing the area, trying to let's say, maintain their positions around the village. Probably the Russians were repelling Ukrainian counterattacks, and just now, just today, on the 2nd of June, the Russians were 100% sure that the Ukrainians are no longer available to force the Russians to fall back, and they announced about complete control over the village. Furthermore, according to different mappers, the Russians continue moving further to the west on the line Semyonovka, Novosylovka, Pershe, and as a result of offensive, the Russians managed to clear the fields between Semyonovka, Orlovka, Umanske, getting closer and closer to the next Ukrainian stronghold, Novosylovka, Pershe, Novopokrovska, where also we can find significant, very heavy, big Ukrainian positions with significant number of forces. Furthermore, we are moving further to the south in direction of Krasnogorovka. The Russians published just few videos of counter-artillery duels of 238 artillery brigade. This is one of the most experienced artillery brigades in the Russian forces. Currently, there are two areas, it's Kharkiv direction and the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians conducting super, let's say, effective counter-artillery duels. Tens or maybe hundreds of armored vehicles and artillery systems were destroyed as a result of counter-artillery fire. For example, in that video, we saw one vehicle destroyed. On this video, we can see another vehicle destroyed by the Russian forces, D-20 howitzer. If we move further to the South Donetsk direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got significant number of icons with the yellow skull, which confirms that the Russians discovered and destroyed additional artillery systems on this direction. So complete superiority, and this is the work of 238 artillery brigade of the armed forces of Russian Federation. Once again, to understand the level of experience of this brigade, we need to increase the numbers of this since the 1st of May, and we can count probably hundreds of Ukrainian artillery systems and vehicles that were destroyed by the Russians. The Ukrainians can't get very close to this area. As soon as they appear on this direction, the Russians hunt them, discover them, laugh at them, and destroy them, as Zelensky says. Now let's move to Konstantinovka and Krasnogorovka, Konstantinovka and Novomikhailivka direction. The forces of 79th Brigade reported that the situation is nowhere more critical. Soon we will lose. There is not enough strength to defend a few days at most. That was the statement about Paraskoyevka. So probably during this upcoming week, the Russians will establish complete control over the village. Furthermore, we have big fire anomalies as in Katerinovka and Konstantinovka as well. In the western part of Konstantinovka and central part of Katerinovka, the areas for rotation, the areas of evacuation, the Russians hunt this area, the Russians control the movements of the Ukrainians, and as soon as they see something, they destroy this at once. The most important thing, once again, that we don't see almost nothing from the Ukrainian side, just few FPV drone strikes, just few attacks, and complete absence of any counter-artillery duels. Either the Ukrainians don't have enough of reconnaissance equipment, the reconnaissance drones that they can use deep inside the territory of Russian Federation to confirm successful counter-artillery duels, or they don't have possibilities to counterattack the Russians. Very interesting details are coming from the line Salota-Vodyane. This is the area of responsibilities of 72nd Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. We have additional progress from the Russian side. The video was published how the Russians were moving along this Balkan, and as a result of another attack, most of the mappers have adjusted their maps, showing additional progress of the Russian forces. So the Russians were moving something like this, very slow, but they were moving. That was another turtle tank. Currently, the status of this part of this area is unknown. Some mappers have already adjusted their maps showing this territory under complete Russian control. Some mappers show just a part of this area and the Ukrainians part under the Russians. So for now we are not going to change the color of the map. We need more updates, but most likely the Ukrainians are no longer available to support this area, and most likely during the next few days the forces of 72nd Mechanized Brigade will be forced to fall back further to the west in direction of the T0524 road. I'll remind you, just during the previous week, starting of let's say the late May, the Russians first managed to establish complete control over this part by attack with light vehicles. If you remember, there was like Russian RIS armored vehicles with modern electronic warfare equipment. Then we have the video of Russian tank attack a little bit further to the south. During the previous days we got the video how the Russians were storming this red network of the fortifications, and today we got report how the Russian tanks improved their positions further from Salotka to the west in direction of Vodyane. So that's 4 days, 4 videos, and 4 let's say updates on map. And this is very important because we see that the Russians are moving to Vodyane. The Russians are shortening the distance between artillery systems, tank let's say systems, tanks, and the main supply road. So this operation is just at the beginning. Of course, we understand that the main purpose of this attack is to get to Vodyane and to encircle Ugledar from the northeast, but obviously in 2-3 months the Russians will be able to cut the main supply road O524, and most likely that by the end of the summer the Russians will capture Ugledar, Vodyane, and Krasnogorov, Konstantinovka itself. Now let's move further to Vremivka tactical bridgehead. As you can see, we haven't received anything. The Russians continue clearing operation. Just few FAB videos of FAB strikes somewhere to the north in direction of Starozhova. Nothing special. Now let's move to Zaporizhzhia area. The same story. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces around the area. The Ukrainians are building significant fortifications. As you can see, this is the fortifications, trenches, and the strongholds that Ukrainians have already created in Orekhov direction. So the Ukrainians are really afraid of possible Russian attack to Zaporizhzhia, so they try to build as many as possible, and the Russians of course see the same story, and it's very interesting whether the Russians are going to ever attack these trenches or not, or the Ukrainians will be able to stabilize Orekhov direction forever. Rabotina, no changes on the ground, just a regular activity around the village, trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back further to Novodanilovka. So very interesting situation, very interesting updates, but probably the most important events are coming from the Western countries, from Zelensky and from China. Before that, few videos were published from Poland. On this video we can see another batch of Polish tanks, RT-91. They were spotted somewhere in the vicinity of the border with Ukraine. Probably another batch of vehicles that were heading to the line of combat contact. Furthermore, we have another video of how the Western countries were sending additional batch of Abrams tanks, also moving, heading to the border with Poland, to the border with Ukraine. And this is another batch of vehicles that most likely soon we're going to see on the line of combat contact. Now let's talk about important political events. Today China reported, more precisely Xi Jinping stated that China says it will forcefully stop Taiwan independence. So now yesterday China Minister of Defense reported that they decided to choose Russia in the world conflict and to all together with Russia to fight for justice in the world. And today China reported that they will stop the independence of Taiwan by force. So obviously we understand what kind of things are going to happen during the next few years and where the next conflict is going to take place. The question is whether the Russians are able to finish the conflict before the beginning of Taiwan conflict or not. From the other side, we have very important statement from Zelensky. Today he crossed the red line. He crossed the final red line in the relations with China, and Zelensky in Singapore criticized China, which refused to participate in the Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland. China is a tool in Putin's hand. Obviously, that was the red line that was crossed by Zelensky. Probably from this statement, from this small sentence, Zelensky broke any relations with China, and from this very moment, most likely China, and probably during the next few weeks, maybe in a month, China will not recognize Zelensky as a, let's say, legal leader of Ukraine, and most likely after this statement, we can expect something like this from Xi Jinping's side. Furthermore, we got report for now unconfirmed that Saudi Arabia also refused and also will not take part in the conference on Ukraine in Switzerland. So more and more countries are refusing this to participate in this, let's say, peaceful conference in the Switzerland, and most likely this is going to be just a small party where Zelensky and other leaders who will come there will eat some food, probably eat some burgers, and that's it. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.